also work as an educational consultant where I work with schools primarily in District 4 and community-based organizations that provide academic support services. The most important title that I can say is I'm also husband to Pamela and father to Justin and Jeremy. Justin, who's 12 years old, and I can't believe 12.
I can't.
Jeremy, who's 7 years old. Anybody here a parent besides being a teacher or administrator? Parent. Being a parent's hard, y'all, isn't it? So if you're a teacher or not a parent, then you can send them home to their parents at the end of the day, right? But mine is like the gift that keeps on giving. One of the things that I try to do as a psychologist by training is trying to figure out ways to meet the needs of my kids. And it's a struggle constantly, right? There's a lot of difficulty. There's frustration, there's hard times. Like I tell some of my colleagues, there's times when my psychology textbooks help me to understand my kids better, and there's times when I use it kind of like a weapon, right? There are times when my kids give me a lot of joy. There's other times I look at them and I say, man, if I didn't need the tax deduction, guys, right? And so one of the struggles that I often encounter when I work with people, and I'm just going to move around over here because I just need to be free. One of the struggles that I encounter when I work with kids in schools is sometimes people get frustrated about how kids operate, right? Kids don't want to learn. They don't want to do this. They don't want to do that. What's the problem with these kids today? And one of the things that I want to start to talk about is going to kind of piggyback off of what Abby was talking about, is some of the broader settings, some of the broader contextual things that influence how kids perform. There's a great book that's called Young, Gifted, and Black. And in the book, one of the authors, Teresa Perry, is interviewing people, asking them about their perspectives on public education. And one of the things that she finds is she's talking to a woman who's no sharecropper, it's an elderly woman. And she's giving her perspective on public education, and what she says is that if the corn don't grow, no one blames the corn. But when we think about children, and children particularly moving into middle school and adolescence, and think about their academic performance, oftentimes we tend to problematize things within children. It's a condition of the child. It's a characteristic of the child, rather than thinking about some of the broader contextual things that might influence how kids perform in schools. So if we start to think about some of the multiple influences, what I'm going to do is kind of go back over some of the things that my colleague Dr. Jukes just talked about it, but kind of put a little bit of a different perspective on it, particularly thinking about how children and adolescents experience their daily lives and how the life outside of school might influence the ways in which they learn and behave in school. So if we look at factors that influence student achievement, again, if we put the child at the center of these concentric circles, using an ecological framework as the model, there are a lot of different factors that might influence how children might perform in schools and influence their things like motivation and by proxy their levels of achievement. I work in East Harlem, right? And there's a lot of research that looks at the environmental factors that impact upon kids in schools in East Harlem. Right? Some of the schools I work in have high levels of absenteeism, and some recent work out of the Harlem Children's Zone focuses on asthma rates, and asthma being a high reason for why children are absent from school. And asthma, 1/3 of asthma, research by Landrigan, he's a gentleman over at Mount Sinai Hospital, has been able to identify about 1/3 of the cases of asthma have environmental factors or environmental causes, right? So the question is, well, what's going on here? So thinking about things like how the environmental factors impact upon schools, you can't necessarily directly impact upon it, but this is a purpose of helping us to understand, right? Understand what some of those broad factors might be. So environmental factors. Food. What I do as an educational consultant is I try to be really a researcher of children. I don't go into schools to talk to them about how to teach math better. I'm a psychologist by training. You got other people to do that. What I try to do is help schools better understand their students, help teachers better understand their students, help to tell students stories better as a way to help inform instruction. And so what I try to do is when I work with a school, I tend to go to schools really early in the morning so that I can observe some of the routines that kids engage in before they start school. So if I'm in East Harlem, I need to know what blimpies you're going to, what bodega you're hitting before you get to that school, because I want to see what kinds of choices you're making, right, about the kinds of food that you eat. What kinds of environments are you creating for yourself in terms of needs for socialization before school? And some of the research that focuses on the food piece has looked at the kinds of foods that schools offer children to eat. So if you go to school foods, you can see they've got this great array of healthy food. The question is, what kinds of foods do kids choose to eat? And as kids get through middle school and high school, of course, those choices become much more self-determined, and you oftentimes see a lot of healthy stuff in the garbage can, right? Unfortunately, right? Thinking about the peer groups. So, sorry about that. The peer groups. Who are kids hanging out with? And what social spaces do they create for themselves? So when I do work with middle schools, primarily one of the things I look at is to see how do schools meet the developmental needs of the kids. Right? And so some of the schools I work in, they'll say things like, these kids are always talking in class. They're always talking. They're talking in the hallway, they're talking in class. And I'm like, yeah, that's what they're supposed to do, right? So the question is not about how do you get them to stop talking. The question is how do you create spaces where children can socialize with each other in ways that don't impact negatively upon instruction in your schools. Because in the absence of that, kids find places to do what they need to have done. And so when I work with schools and I see kids hanging out in the corner and they're coming to school late first period, it's because they know that that's the last time they're going to get to hang out with their friends, or it's the last time that they're going to get to socialize. And so if schools can adapt to those needs, then kids will come in on time. What kinds of video games and technology use do kids have? And I'm very much interested in video gaming, particularly because I have an adolescent son. Right? And a lot of the research talks about adolescent boys as being huge consumers of video game technology, but more importantly, the kind of games that kids are drawn to. Right? So if you look at some of the consistent themes and messages that kids see over and over again in games, particularly boys are being interested in first-person shooter games. Right? A lot of the research shows that girls are much more interested in games where there's a lot of social engagement, interaction, right? Some of the fantasy play type games. Boys, first-person shooter games, typically with not much consequences as a result of the things that are happening in the game, right? So you get killed in a game, you just hit restart, right? There's no other outside consequences, right? Thinking about interactions with adults. And so parents, primary caregivers, teachers, what other kinds of compensatory mechanisms are out there for kids to help them? A lot of the research, particularly around boys and adolescents and looking at aggressive behavior in boys, shows that if boys have social supports that are stable and consistent, whether it be father, particularly male supports, it can be found in many different ways. It could be the reverend, uncle, friend, regardless. The idea is consistent presence decreases the amount of aggressiveness in kids, right? And thereby increases their behavior in school, right? These consistent bonds. The structure of school also impacts upon achievement. So if we think about things like Abby had mentioned play, and I think Janet mentioned play earlier, thinking about opportunities for movement during the school day. Right? Just because kids are getting older doesn't mean that they don't have those same needs. Right? And so if I'm in a middle school setting or even a high school setting and kids are sitting down for a very long period of time, it impacts negatively upon their ability to maintain attention. If you think about those same kids as playing a lot of video games, you think about short-term memory being strong, but this longer-term memory and attention being negatively impacted upon. Right? So outside influences impacting upon school performance. Another piece of interesting research for me is around the area of sleep. And it's a real simple thing that people always forget, but it's amazing how influential it can be in terms of learning and behavior of kids in school. So there's a lot of research that argues that physiologically, as kids get older, they fall asleep later, right? If you think about circadian rhythms and the times in which they fall asleep. The problem, of course, is that the need for sleep doesn't decrease as rapidly, right? And so kids still need a lot of sleep, but they're not getting it. And I tell a lot of my colleagues, there's a difference between the time in which parents put kids to sleep and the time that they actually fall asleep. And if you have access to technology, it even makes it worse. So for my kids, they say, well, Dad, when am I going to get a television in my room? And I'm like, when you can pay a mortgage, right? Because that's not just, it ain't happening, right? And the reason why is because it impacts upon the sleep routine. Kids start to fall asleep. Think about yourselves. If you watch something on TV that kind of excites you, right? That gets you interested, and it's late at night, you tend to be more aroused. It keeps you up later. When I do sleep surveys in schools, I find that kids are sleeping about 6 to 7 hours a night, or less, middle school, high school, when the need for sleep is about 8 to 10 hours a night. So if you look at that alone, you're seeing in a week of school, kids are consistently sleep deprived. And it has negative impacts upon not just behavior, but learning directly. So sometimes when I work with parent groups, I talk about those things, thinking about sleep hygiene, thinking about quiet spaces, thinking about consistency. So for very, very young children, this idea of a sleep routine, a bedtime story, a consistent time, that becomes critically important. Cognitive neural repair takes place during that time. Think about yourselves. Anybody here tired right now? Check that out. Check that out. See, I'm moving around, trying to be motivating, and y'all still fall asleep. Right? Anybody here hungry? Exactly, right? So, I mean, as adults, you guys can play it off. So even if you're not interested in what I have to say and completely bored, you're nice enough to just smile. Right? My middle schoolers are like, oh, God, this is so boring, right? They'll be just straight up, right? It's the authenticity that's impressive, but at the same time frustrating, right? So kids manifest behaviors in these negative ways as a result of some of these factors, right? These are kind of what we might call setting events. In terms of sleep, one of the things that I try to do is look to see how sleep might be masking other things that we tend to be focusing on. Again, it goes back to this idea of problematizing things. Anybody here have a child who might be classified as having ADHD? ADHD, right? So the hands in the background, right? If we think about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, most of the research shows it's one of the most overdiagnosed and misdiagnosed things out there, right? With no kind of consistent way of identifying it. So we have a lot of people who we think might have ADHD, and it's just a child who might just be bouncing around a little bit, right? We don't really know, right? So the idea is not to say that there's not legitimate cases of it. The idea is that it's misdiagnosed and overdiagnosed and overly medicated. Right? So those are major concerns. So what I did is I looked at some of the data around the impact of sleep deprivation, and I charted it relative to ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. And when you start characterizing it in this way, you see straight similarities, right? So we might see things like inattentiveness, impulsivity. These are the major characteristics of ADHD, right? But they're also associated with sleep deprivation. Right? So there are some studies to indicate that when parents have children classified as having ADHD and they focus on sleep patterns and sleep hygiene, that parents report that the ADHD symptoms tend to decrease, if not go away, in certain cases, right? So the question then becomes is, was it really ADHD in the first place, or was it really a function of just sleep deprivation, right? The reason why I'm talking about these things is because these are like the big picture things. You're in your classroom trying to figure out how come this person's not doing X, Y, or Z and struggling, right? You've planned this great lesson, you worked all weekend on it, you walk into the classroom, the kids are like, ugh, right? Or they're bouncing around, right? And there are a lot of other things that are impacting upon what's going on in the classroom. But particularly when I work with middle schoolers and high school students, the idea of being more self-determined, being in control of situations and arming them with information that can benefit them becomes critically important. So I talk to kids about food choices and healthy food choices. I talk to them about sleep and the importance of that, because I want to arm them with information where they can be in control. And that's a typical feature of middle school kids and high school kids, this idea of needing to be more in control of their environment. Right, so in terms of thinking about achievement declines, and I want to keep this, I'm trying to look at the clock over there as I'm talking, because like my friends know, my mom says I have enough mouth for another set of teeth, so I'm trying to balance this out. If we think about achievement declines and try to figure out like what's the cause of this thing, right? What's causing it? There are a lot of different lines of research that try to address the same question from different perspectives. And the answer is the truth's in the middle, right? It's a combination of factors, clearly. So there's a line of research that focuses on school leadership, and they try to figure out, their differential effects depending on the effectiveness of the leader, broadly defined, right? So in terms of how leaders interact with teachers, how they construct environments in school climate, how they interface with parents, all those things, right? And so that's one line of research. Another line of research focuses much more on pedagogical practices. So what are some of the strategies that teachers use to teach, right? And so lots of different research. And one of the areas of research that I'm very much interested in is around culturally responsive teaching practices, right? And so the idea here is thinking about the kids that I work with, particularly the kids that I work with in East Harlem. Oftentimes they're reinforced with this idea that their community is a place that they need to escape from in order to be successful. And so they start from that premise. So everything is about, I need to take you out over there. I need to get you to that place. If I can only get you over there, it would be better. And so one of the things that I try to do is to work with schools to help their teachers to see that community as a source of strength, right? As a resource, and try to make connections between children's lived experiences outside of school and the things that they're learning in school. And the more directly you can make that practical connection, the more kids are going to get it, the more they're going to be engaged, right? Because when kids can say something like, you know what, you talked to us about this last Friday, and on Sunday I actually used this thing, right? Think about how powerful that is. Kids can come in and say, you know what, this wasn't a bunch of garbage, right? This had some practical applicability. Another line of research focuses on school transitions, and that's kind of like school structural things. I work primarily with K through 8 schools, right? And a lot of them have similar histories. They were K through 6 schools that were then asked to take on additional grades, right? And so the question becomes, well, how does my school have to change in order to meet the needs of kids now who are 7th and 8th graders? One of the interesting things that I found in a lot of the schools that I work with is there's a lot of different factors in play. And one of those factors is really just teacher preparation. A lot of the K through 8 schools that I work in have teachers teaching 7th and 8th grade who were elementary certified, right? And so a lot of times it gets at that level of, I'm just not used to working with kids at this level. And so we need some assistance help me to better understand these kids. Another idea around transitions is that with every kind of major transition, academic declines are present, right? And achievement declines are present. And so the K through 6 model, in a sense, was trying to get rid of some of those earlier transition points, thinking that that might be a better way. right? As kids transition, and even now you'll see it as kids transition from a 5th grade to a 6th grade, or an 8th grade to a 9th grade, you start to see declines in their performance. And some of those declines are really linked to how kids feel about their place in school, the social relationships that they have in schools, their connectedness to their teachers in schools, and all those things will impact upon their performance. So kids coming out of a 5th grade who feel much more connected to the teacher, who they might have had for more than one subject, now moving into a 6th grade or 7th grade where they might have multiple teachers, not making those connections. We also see that as we move from the elementary to the middle to the high school, there's much more focus on performance evaluations and comparative evaluations. So it's much more about how you perform relative to everybody else, right? How do you score on this assessment relative to that other school, right? And these performance-based evaluations, as I get to in a moment, can also negatively impact upon student motivation, right? And so if we're looking at the links between motivation and achievement, they're clear, right? And so sometimes it's about the structure of schools and the focus of schools that's impacting upon some of the things we're trying to address. The last thing that I want to talk about in this area, which is going to focus on a little bit more, is this idea of students' perceptions of themselves and their abilities. As we move from the elementary school to the middle and the high school, there's much more of this idea of introspection on the part of kids. They become much more self-aware, right? They're thinking about themselves relative to others, and they're developing this focus of group affiliation and group identity. And so part of this idea is that these comparative evaluations of themselves, how do they compare to others, is something that begins earlier on. So in kindergarten, you might hear kids saying, I'm taller than that kid, or I'm faster than that one, I'm stronger than that one, I'm smarter than this one. Right? As they get older, these things become much more at the core of who they are and how they feel about themselves. And so things like motivation, things like self-efficacy, we're going to talk about in a moment, those become core things for kids as they move through middle into high school. So self-efficacy, if you're familiar with the term self-efficacy, right, it's basically your belief in your ability to be successful in a nutshell. Right? And there are lots of different things that impact upon self-efficacy. Some of the things that impact upon your belief in your ability to be successful is your prior performance. Right? And so prior performance is a great predictor for kids, right? And so if we think about, oftentimes kids might walk into your classroom in the first day already not liking your class. Or if you're a middle school teacher or high school teacher, already not liking your subject, right? And thereby not liking you because you teach that subject. You've never interacted with them. Like, maybe they might, you might say something like, well, I'd rather them come to dislike me, but at least let me prove that I'm not the nice person that I'm just joking, right? But the idea is that early on, kids' prior performance is going to impact upon how they think about themselves, how they think about your content, right? And so that's one thing that drives it. Another is the idea of vicarious experience. And what we mean by that is the experiences of kids who are similar to themselves can oftentimes help them to feel that they can be successful. Have you ever tried to do something that you've never done before, like go skiing, horseback riding, or something like that gave you a little bit of anxiety, but you did it with friends or other people who you knew, right? And you let them go first, like I would normally do, right? And you kind of think, what, if that idiot could do it, then I think I can do it too, right? I mean, that's what we mean by vicarious experience. And the idea is that when kids are around other kids who can be successful, right, they tend to feel like, I think I can do that too. Right? I think it's possible for me. I think I can achieve that. And so it's critically important not just to think about the child in isolation, but who the child surrounds himself or herself with, and how we can structure, even help to foster certain kinds of social networks and social groups within schools. In terms of motivation and goals, there's a whole line of research that focuses on goal orientation. And ultimately what it comes down to is kind of like what am I doing this for? Why am I doing this? As kids get older, there's lots of whys. Not like, why do I have to do this, but like, what's the meaning of this? Right? What's the purpose of this? When I taught middle school, I had lots of times I remember teaching like a mathematics lesson, and kids telling me, who's gonna stop me on the street and ask me to solve for X? Right? And I was like, you're right. So it's my job to help you to understand how that mathematical thinking can help you in your lives, right? The importance of that line of thinking, but not necessarily specifically connected. Couple of different kinds of goals that become important, and this has implications for how we teach and how schools are organized. The idea of mastery goals really means kind of like this ideal goal orientation. What we mean by that is that kids who are focusing on learning because they want to learn, right? And so these are the kids who will ask themselves, have I learned this thing? Have I acquired this skill? Right? Am I learning to my ability? Those are the kids who are focusing much more on this internal drive and internal need to be successful. Performance goals focus on two things, right? The performance of a particular task, oftentimes relative to other people. So it's not about, am I learning just because I'm interested in learning, and that's my personal goal, but more so about how am I performing relative to everybody else in the class, and that becomes the standard. So for some kids, if everybody's not doing well and they're just doing a little bit better, that's fine. They don't need to push themselves because that's not their goal. Now, with respect to performance goals, there's two things here. One is this idea of a performance approach goal, and one is a performance avoidance goal. And so a performance approach goal is a child who has a perspective of, when you present them with a task, they're evaluating the task, and they're saying to themselves, am I gonna look smart doing this thing? This is gonna make me look smart. And so any task that you give them to a degree becomes almost like a risk-taking activity, where they're checking to see, how's it gonna make me feel? Sometimes kids have a sense of being smart that's not a really strong sense of being smart. It's a fragile sense of being smart. And so it becomes a risk-taking event when you give them an activity because it might make them not feel so smart. And that's a scary thing. On the other side, we have kids who are performance avoidant who look at tasks and say, is this thing gonna make me look dumb? Right? Is this thing gonna look stupid? I'm not gonna look stupid trying to do this thing. I'm not even gonna try this, because if I try this thing, I'm gonna look so stupid that I'm gonna feel terrible, so I ain't even gonna try it. Understand what I'm saying? So the question then becomes, if children have this cognitive mindset, how does it impact upon their behavior in your classroom? Right? And so for children with these performance focuses, particularly on the performance avoidance goals, children will try sometimes to avoid a task that they ultimately think will make them not feel so smart. Right? And so the question then becomes, how is avoidance manifested? So in some cases, avoidance might simply be refusal to do something. Right? They might lean back in their chair, they might look around, there's all these other strategies that they might use to occupy their mind to not focus on the task. Other children might have other kinds of strategies where they might talk back to a teacher, curse a teacher out, hit a kid next to them, say something about somebody's mama, just to get themselves kicked out of the classroom, right? With the ultimate goal of removal from the setting, therefore I don't have to complete this task, therefore it doesn't impact upon my feelings of how smart or dumb I might be.